David Langley walked briskly down the courthouse corridor, his polished leather shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. With over a decade of service under his belt, David felt a deep sense of pride. His uniform was not just a symbol of authority, it was his tool to control and dominate, especially over people he considered beneath him. For David, the law was less about protecting the innocent and more about keeping the undesirable in line. Today, David's job was to provide security at a crucial trial. A black man was accused of theft, and as usual, David had already made up his mind about the case. They're all the same, he thought bitterly, just criminals, nothing more. As he strode down the hallway, his eyes narrowed at the people around him, mostly witnesses, lawyers, and court officers. But one person caught his attention. A black woman dressed in a sharp, professional suit was walking toward him. She wasn't flashy but still exuded an air of sophistication that made David uncomfortable. "Watch where you're going," he snapped, his voice harsh and filled with irritation. The woman paused, looking surprised by his outburst. "Sorry, I didn't mean to bump into you," she said calmly. But to David, that wasn't enough. "Typical," he muttered under his breath, "you people never know your place." The woman didn't respond, but David could see the faint frown on her face. This only irritated him more. He crossed his arms, standing in her path. "What are you doing here? This area isn't for people like you." She raised an eyebrow, unshaken. "I have business in court," she answered evenly, as if stating a fact. David scoffed, a smirk creeping onto his face. "Let me guess," he said sarcastically, "you're here to support the defendant, right? Or maybe you're one of those people who like to shout, 'Justice,' whenever someone gets arrested." The woman didn't flinch at his words. Instead, she simply stood there, her eyes locked on him. The hallway grew quiet, with a few onlookers beginning to notice the tense exchange between the officer and the woman. David's smirk deepened. He was in control of the situation. After all, he was a police officer, and she was just another black woman in his eyes. "You don't belong here," he said coldly. "Leave now." The woman's expression didn't change, she remained calm, almost detached. "I have every right to be here," she stated, her voice firm yet calm. David's temper flared. "I don't think so," he sneered. "I'm not letting you disrupt things here." Without a second thought, he raised his hand, signaling to two other officers nearby. "Take her out," he ordered. The two officers exchanged uncertain glances but, under David's command, approached the woman. "Please leave the area," one of them said hesitantly. But the woman didn't move. She didn't argue, nor did she show any fear. She just stood still, her eyes locked on David's, unblinking and unwavering. David felt a twinge of frustration. He stepped forward and gave the order again, this time more forcefully. "I said, get her out." The officers grabbed the woman by the arms, pulling her toward the door. The air around them thickened as murmurs began to rise from the crowd in the hallway. Some people stared in disbelief, others started to whisper among themselves. But David was too caught up in his own sense of authority to notice. He watched the woman being dragged out, a sense of satisfaction momentarily filling him. Before the door closed behind her, the woman turned slightly, meeting his gaze one last time. For the briefest moment, David felt a chill run down his spine. There was something in her eyes, a calmness that unsettled him. But he quickly dismissed it. "Just another black woman put in her place," he muttered under his breath, trying to push the unsettling feeling away. David Langley stood tall, arms crossed, watching the woman being forcibly dragged out of the courtroom. His colleagues at the security checkpoint followed his orders without question, their hands gripping her arms tightly as they escorted her out. He felt a surge of satisfaction. This was how things should be. A black woman daring to challenge his authority had been put in her place. As she passed through the doorway, David allowed himself a smug smile. But before the door fully shut behind her, she turned her head slightly, her eyes locking onto his for a moment. The air in the hallway grew still. It was a fleeting glance, but in it, David felt something strange, something he couldn't quite place. The woman's eyes were cold, calculating, but there was something else. It wasn't fear or anger, just an unnerving calmness, as if she wasn't rattled in the slightest by the ordeal, as though it didn't matter to her at all. The thought sent a strange chill through David's spine, but he quickly shrugged it off. She was just another black person, after all, one that needed to be taught a lesson. David shook his head, trying to clear the unsettling feeling. He turned his attention back to the scene before him, but the atmosphere in the hallway had changed. People were looking at him differently now, some in confusion, others in silent judgment. A few court officers glanced his way, their eyes filled with unease, but none of them dared to speak up. Still, he felt the tension building around him, and his earlier confidence began to waver. It was then that Jonathan Pierce, a prominent civil rights lawyer known for his courtroom victories, stepped into the scene. He had been watching the exchange from a distance and now approached David, his face unreadable. "David," Pierce said, his voice calm but sharp, "do you know what you've just done?" David turned to him, his expression hardening. "I did what I had to do. She didn't belong here." Pierce's eyes narrowed, and he shook his head. "You've just kicked out one of the most important people in this country." He glanced briefly at the now absent woman. "That woman is Dr. Emily Carter, Deputy Director of Federal Security. You just threw out a high-ranking government official." David froze. For the first time, his arrogance faltered. His mind struggled to process what Pierce had just said. Dr. Emily Carter, the Deputy Director of Federal Security? A sudden, heavy silence fell over the hallway. David's face turned pale as the realization hit him like a freight train. He had just made the worst mistake of his career. He tried to deny it, but deep down, he knew it was true. His world, once so firmly in his grasp, was beginning to crumble. As if on cue, Dr. Carter's voice rang out from the hallway, calm but firm. "I need a task force here immediately," she said, speaking into her phone as she dialed a number. The words echoed in David's ears, and his body froze in place. Pierce, his face filled with concern, watched David closely. "I suggest you prepare an explanation for your actions," he warned, "because I promise you, this is only the beginning." David's heart sank. He had no idea how deep the hole he had just dug for himself would go. The crowd around them began to murmur, the weight of what had just occurred settling in. A few people around the courthouse, witnesses to the confrontation, took out their phones. Others began to whisper in hushed tones. The incident was already beginning to spread. Soon, the whole world would know, and the worst part was that David had no way out. Just then, a voice from behind him snapped David out of his thoughts. It was the Chief Justice of the court, a stern-looking man in his 60s. He had been observing the scene from afar, and now his voice thundered through the hallway, silencing everything around him. "Officer Langley," the Chief Justice's tone was sharp, commanding, "you need to report to my office immediately." David's stomach twisted, his heart raced as the weight of the situation pressed down on him. He stammered, trying to defend himself. "I didn't do anything wrong. I was just doing my job." But the Chief Justice wasn't having it. "Your job is not to disrespect and remove a government official, officer. Now, get to my office, now." David stood there for a moment, completely stunned. He couldn't believe what was happening. His mind raced, his thoughts a blur, but he had no choice. He had to go to the office, and he knew that once he walked through those doors, nothing would be the same. David Langley's legs felt like lead as he trudged down the hallway, heading toward the Chief Justice's office. The tension in the air felt suffocating, each step heavier than the last. His mind raced, replaying the moment when Dr. Emily Carter had revealed her true identity, Deputy Director of Federal Security, a high-ranking government official. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him with each passing second. He had always believed that his uniform and badge gave him a level of invincibility. But now, with the entire courthouse watching him and the realization of what he had done settling in, he felt more exposed than ever. His pride, which he had held so dearly, had just been shattered. Worse yet, the consequences were already beginning to unfold. As he reached the Chief Justice's office, he was greeted by a cold silence. The door opened, and David stepped inside. The Chief Justice, along with a few other court officials, stood waiting. David's chest tightened as he was ushered into the room. Everyone's eyes were on him, and the weight of their collective gaze was almost unbearable. "Sit down, Officer Langley," the Chief Justice ordered, his voice stern. David complied, though he could feel the sweat beginning to form on his brow. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but every word seemed to escape him. What could he possibly say to justify what he had done? In his mind, he was still trying to convince himself that he had acted correctly, but deep down, he knew he hadn't. After a long, uncomfortable silence, the Chief Justice spoke again. "We've already received word from the Federal Security Office, and I've been informed of your actions today. Do you understand the magnitude of what you've done?" David opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He simply nodded, his throat dry, his mind too clouded to formulate a coherent response. The Chief Justice's voice grew sharper. "You have just insulted and forcibly removed a government official from this building, a person who, if I may remind you, holds a position of significant authority. Do you understand the gravity of your actions?" David's face burned with shame. He had assumed Dr. Carter was just another person to control, just another person who didn't belong in the spaces he patrolled. But now, seeing the concern in the faces of those around him, it was clear that he had overstepped in a way he could not undo. Outside the room, whispers were starting to spread. The courthouse staff, the lawyers, the court officers, they were all talking about what had just happened. Phones were already buzzing with texts and notifications. The media, ever hungry for controversy, was beginning to pick up the story. David's head spun. How had things escalated so quickly? In less than an hour, his actions had gone from an internal conflict to an all-out scandal. Just then, the door to the office opened, and Jonathan Pierce walked in, his expression grim. He nodded at the Chief Justice, acknowledging the situation, then his gaze turned to David. It wasn't a look of anger or disdain but rather one of quiet disappointment. "David," Pierce said softly, "I tried to warn you." David clenched his fists, frustration rising within him. "I was just doing my job," he muttered, though even to himself, his words sounded hollow. Pierce shook his head. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to harass and degrade. What you've done is more than just a mistake, it's a violation of everything you swore to uphold." David's stomach churned. He wanted to argue, to say that he had been right, that Dr. Carter was out of line, but he couldn't. Every time he thought of how easily he had dismissed her, how casually he had tried to wield his authority, it made him sick to his stomach. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, things were only getting worse for David. The incident had gone viral. Videos of the confrontation, of David shouting at Dr. Carter, of her being dragged out by officers, had flooded social media. Activists had already started to rally, calling for accountability, demanding that the police department take action against David. The public's response was swift and unforgiving. Headlines began to emerge: police officer kicks out federal security director from courtroom, racist abuse at court, officer violates civil rights. The comment sections beneath every post were filled with outrage. Some people condemned the police as a whole, while others specifically targeted David, calling him everything from power-hungry to racist. David's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, eyes narrowing as he read the message from a colleague. "David, we're getting calls from everywhere. People are demanding action. The higher-ups are not happy." A cold wave of panic washed over him. He had no idea how quickly things could spiral out of control. His career, his reputation, everything was falling apart, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't stop it. As the minutes ticked by, David began to realize that this wasn't just a mistake that could be swept under the rug. This was bigger than him, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure how to fix it. The next morning, the fallout from David Langley's actions was already in full swing. News outlets across the country were reporting on the incident. Videos from the courthouse were being shared and commented on by millions. The raw footage of David screaming at Dr. Emily Carter, ordering her to leave, and the subsequent dragging out of a high-ranking federal official was everywhere. The public was outraged, and the pressure on the police department to act quickly was growing by the hour. Inside the police department, the atmosphere had shifted. Where once David had been a respected officer, a veteran of the force who had the ear of his superiors, now he was an outcast. Whispers followed him wherever he went. His colleagues, who had once admired him, now avoided eye contact or quietly stepped out of his way. The once unspoken protection he'd enjoyed from those higher up was evaporating. No one wanted to be associated with him anymore. David entered the police station that morning, his head low, his stomach churning with dread. As he walked down the hall, every officer he passed seemed to turn away, pretending not to see him. Mark Reynolds, one of his few friends, stood near the water cooler, his back to David. When he turned and saw him approaching, there was no greeting, no acknowledgement, just a heavy sigh. "You know they're coming for you, right?" Mark said, his voice low. "The higher-ups, the media, it's over for you, man." David wanted to argue, to explain that it wasn't as bad as it seemed, but deep down, he knew Mark was right. Everything he had built, his career, his reputation, was crumbling. The people who had once supported him were now distancing themselves. No one wanted to be caught in the wake of his mistake. As the day wore on, it only got worse for David. The chief inspector called him into his office, his expression as cold and stern as ever. He motioned for David to sit down, then slid a stack of papers across the desk. "Do you know what this is?" the chief inspector asked, his voice carrying a weight that made David's chest tighten. David glanced down at the papers and saw that they were complaints, dozens of them, many spanning several years. Complaints about his behavior on the job, excessive force, racial profiling, inappropriate comments, and misconduct. His heart sank as he read through the pages. These were all the things he had brushed off as nothing more than disgruntled citizens or people trying to make trouble. But now, in light of what had happened, it seemed as though the department had been quietly keeping track of his actions. The chief inspector continued, his tone grave. "David, we've received formal complaints about you for years, and now, thanks to your behavior yesterday, everything is coming to light. You've been a liability for this department for far too long, and this is the straw that broke the camel's back." David opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. He could feel the walls closing in on him. For the first time in his career, he had no excuses left. The weight of his past misdeeds was now undeniable, and he was paying the price. Outside, the media was relentless. Social media was flooded with hashtags demanding justice, and videos of the incident were being circulated by activists and citizens alike. A video from a bystander, recorded on a phone, showed David shouting at Dr. Carter, calling her disrespectful names before ordering her removal. The comments under the video were scathing, with people expressing outrage over his treatment of an important government official. David's name was now synonymous with racism and abuse of power. The videos sparked outrage not only in the courthouse but across the nation. The hashtag Justice for Dr. Carter trended for hours, and activists were already planning marches and protests. The department was under intense pressure to do something, and quickly. Back at the station, David found himself isolated. His colleagues were now openly talking about him behind his back. The phone calls started coming in, calls from the media, from angry citizens, from civil rights organizations demanding action. The pressure was mounting, and David realized there was no way to avoid the storm that was about to hit. Even the public outcry was growing louder. Calls for disciplinary action against David were flooding the police department's phone lines. The press was relentless, and soon his face would be all over the news, not as a hero, but as an example of everything that was wrong with the police force. David stood there, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. He knew what was coming. He had gone too far this time. He had crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. Days passed, but the fallout from David Langley's actions continued to escalate. The media's spotlight on him had grown fiercer, with every major news outlet running stories about his outburst at the courthouse. His career, once a source of pride and authority, now lay in ruins. The more David tried to hold on to the remnants of his old life, the more it slipped through his fingers. The police department, under immense pressure from the public and government officials, had no choice but to suspend him. The announcement was made through a formal statement that morning: Officer David Langley has been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation into his actions. The department was quick to clarify that they were committed to transparency and would take appropriate action once the investigation was complete. But it was clear to everyone that this wasn't just a suspension, it was the beginning of the end for David. Inside the police station, things had changed drastically. Where once his colleagues had looked up to him, now they avoided him at all costs. The same officers who had once supported his actions were now backing away, unwilling to be associated with him. The air in the station felt tense, and David could feel the weight of their judgment on him every time he walked by. But the worst was yet to come. A few days after his suspension, David was summoned to a disciplinary hearing at the police headquarters. The room was packed with high-ranking officers, media representatives, and civil rights advocates. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, and David's heart pounded in his chest as he entered the room. For the first time in his life, he felt the full force of his actions closing in on him. The disciplinary board, made up of senior officers and legal experts, wasted no time. They laid out the evidence: video footage of his interaction with Dr. Emily Carter, witness testimonies, and a long history of complaints about his behavior. It was all there in black and white. David was guilty, not just of overstepping his authority but of a pattern of misconduct that had been allowed to continue for far too long. David sat in silence as the board presented the facts. His mind raced, but the words he wanted to say seemed to disappear before they could form. He wanted to scream that it wasn't fair, that he was just doing his job, but deep down, he knew the truth. He had abused his power, and now he had no one to protect him. The chairman of the board finally spoke, his voice stern and final. "Officer David Langley, based on the evidence presented here today, we have concluded that you will be permanently dismissed from the police force. You have shown a pattern of racial discrimination and abuse of authority that is unacceptable in this department." The words hit David like a punch to the gut. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, the world seemed to spin around him. He had imagined losing his job, but hearing the finality of the decision made it real in a way he hadn't expected. The chairman continued, but David barely heard the rest. The room seemed to fade away as his mind struggled to process what had just happened. He was no longer a police officer. His badge, his gun, his career, everything he had worked for was gone in an instant. One of the officers approached him with a small box. Without saying a word, he placed it in front of David. The message was clear: hand over your badge. David hesitated, his hands trembling as he slowly removed his badge from his uniform and placed it in the box. Then the officer motioned for him to remove his gun. With shaking hands, David unholstered his weapon and placed it on the table. It was over. The room fell silent as the officers around him exchanged glances. Lorraine Bennett, standing off to the side, watched the entire scene unfold. She didn't speak, but her eyes never left David. The quiet strength in her gaze said everything: justice had been served. As David left the room, reporters swarmed around him, their cameras flashing in rapid succession. "Do you regret your actions?" one of them shouted. "How does it feel to be fired from the police force?" David didn't respond. He couldn't. His mind was too numb, his body too heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. He walked through the crowd of reporters, his head bowed, knowing that no matter what he said, no one wanted to hear it. His reputation was destroyed, and the consequences of his actions had caught up with him. As he exited the police station for the last time, David paused outside. He stood there, staring at the building that had been his home for over a decade. The weight of his loss settled on him like a physical force. He had once believed that he was invincible, that the badge on his chest gave him power over others. But now, standing in front of that building, he realized just how wrong he had been. The world had changed, and so had he, but it was too late. Dr. Emily Carter had shown him what true authority meant, and in the end, it was the law of justice that had caught up with him. David Langley would never forget the price of his arrogance.